Okay, hello and welcome to 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones. I'm Emily Tesh,
And I'm Rebecca Framo.
and we are very excited to explain what we're doing here. So, Diana Wynne Jones was an English author born in 1934, died in 2011, noted for writing more than 30 works of mostly children's fantasy. So, why Diana Wynne Jones? What's so special about this author?
So I'm going to go back to Diana Wynne Jones's own words to describe this for me. This is from her book Reflections, which is a collection of her essays on writing. And in that book, she says, if you inquire further about children's literature, you will find 9 adults admitting that they acquired many of the rules they live by from this children's book that so impressed them. Most adults, in fact, if you question them, will admit that there was this marvelous book they read when they were 8 or 10 or maybe 15 that has lived in their minds ever since. And for me, that's 100% true for Diana Wynne Jones. I acquired I believed everything that she told me without question. I didn't drink beer until I was about 21 because she told me in a book that it tasted bad. And I was like, well, Diana Wynne Jones wouldn't lie to me. And so I just drank wine exclusively until someone convinced me to change my mind.
No, she's right, it tastes bad. I think for me, Diana Wynne Jones is what you might call a writer's writer, in that I've never come across a writer familiar with her work who didn't then go, wow. Um, and I think she's been a huge influence on a generation of speculative fiction writers, which is
Which does include
fascinating,
us.
which does certainly include us. We should mention we are both writers.
Yes.
So I am the author of the Hugo Award winning Some Desperate Glory.
And I am the author of Lady Eve's Last Con. Both of us have written other things as well, but those are the most recent ones. And I think both of us, if you track back, have Diana Wynne Jones pretty clearly visible in the DNA of our works. I don't know if you want to talk about, to go back to Some Desperate Glory, which Diana Wynne Jones book do you think is kind of written into that one?
It's just Hexwood. It's just Hexwood. If you've read Hexwood, you know it's there.
Hopefully we'll
But
get there.
in terms of like Jones's, she had a very long career. She started publishing in 1972, 73, and was still publishing up to her death. But I was looking earlier at sort of the list of awards she was winning during her career, and it's noticeable that if you like the establishment, especially sort of American SFF, doesn't really seem to notice her. She picks up one Hugo Award nomination ever in 1997. It's for Tough Guide to Fantasyland.
Of all the books that she wrote, no shade to Tough Guide, but a
Yeah,
little
it's
shade to
great
Tough
fun,
Guide.
but like, right, there is so much more. But in a way, that's not surprising because she was an author of mostly children's books, and children's books will shape you forever at the age of 10, but it takes you a few decades to get to the place where you are then expressing that influence in your adult work. And Jones herself, in that same essay and Reflections, talked about the responsibility she felt as a children's author. So this is just, I think, a hugely influential writer, certainly for me personally, and I think for a lot of people. We should talk
100%.
about. Go on,
Yes, the
sorry.
project.
The
And where we're
project.
starting with the project. So
Yes.
I think it was your idea to start by breaking this down, breaking her work down into decades, if you want to talk a bit about that.
So, thinking the thing is, when you're looking at a list of, I first had to cut out all the other stuff, so the short story collections, the non-fiction, the plays, the single work of adult contemporary fiction that wasn't very good. I'm like, yeah, let's ignore that.
Yes.
The stuff that's genuinely for younger readers, and you're left with like a list of books which would now be variously middle grade, YA, and adult books. 33 novels spread over 4 decades. And you're like, wow, how do you even get into a body of work like that? And chronological seemed like a way to do it.
As the more we started talking about this and the more excited we got to do this project, the more we could see these connections spreading through these books in a way that seemed really fruitful and interesting to talk about chronologically. I think we've set ourselves a strict rule, which is going to be very hard to keep to, that we're going to talk about the books as we hit them. So we're not going to look forward, but we can look backwards to trace
Yeah.
the impact of things as they go on. But you can see, we started to see sort of early patterns changing and getting more complicated through the oeuvre. Am I pronouncing that right?
I don't even know if I can pronounce it right. Possibly you are. But yeah, no, I think it is interesting to look at an author's complete body of work and to look at their development as a creative force, as an artist over time. Like, you can see her getting better. She starts pretty good, honestly, but you can see her getting more skilled. You can see her ideas developing. You can see ideas coming back and being repeated, and we'll get there. But I have things to say about the Chrestomanci books, especially on this front. But yeah, we are going to try and stick to our chronological rule. I don't know if we can, but we will try not to jump too far ahead. And this reminds me of that time in the 1990s when, and I do think that like the sort of decade by decade approach does give you sort of interesting resonances, not just in terms of like how the books are talking to each other, but also how they're talking to the environment she's writing in. And this is especially true of the 1970s, where I looked at the list and went, that's a lot of books about the Troubles.
Mm-hmm. And we will get there.
Yeah.
But the other thing about breaking it down into discovering that we had 33 books to talk about, if we're going to go all the way through it, and then approximately 8 books per decade, meant that eventually we sort of stumbled into this 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones conceit of eight episodes per season per decade. There's actually, she wrote 9 books in the 70s. And the 70s is one where we're doing it sort of out of order, sort of in order.
It depends which of her essays you believe, because she keeps changing her mind about which one she wrote first.
Unreliable narration. In one essay, though, at least, she claims that even though 8 Days of Luke was the third children's book that she published, she claims at least once that it was the first book that she wrote. And
she does say that. I think she actually forgot Wilkins' Tooth existed, but I don't blame her. I forget it exists too.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's just not meaty.
It's just not Diana Wynne Jones in the same way.
Right.
Like,
you can.
It's not there yet. We will talk about that one, but I think we decided to start with 8 Days of Luke, which is a book which feels to me programmatic.
Yes.
Paradigmatic.
Yes.
Like it is sounding the first note. And also, it's a great book.
And also, it's if we're talking about the project and why we're doing this project, 8 Days of Luke, maybe even more than anything else she wrote a lot of things, has had a ripple effect on the field, on speculative fiction currently today. It prefigures a lot of the way that we look at bringing mythology into what we would call urban fantasy, what we would call sort of present-day takes on these mythological figures, and I think that's something that we want to talk about as we dive into this book.
Oh yeah, I mean, she talks about this a lot in reflections in her essays. Let me find the quote. In 8 Days of Luke, using the days of the week and the Norse gods they were named after to indicate that the big things, the stirring events, the heroic ideal, were as much a part of modern everyday life as Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday.
Yeah. Great quote.
Yeah, she knows what she's doing.
She absolutely does, and I think that you pointed out when we were reading through Reflections, 8 Days of Luke is one of the books that she goes back to and talks about almost more than any other. I think we're not talking about Fire and Hemlock yet, but it maybe beats it out. But other than that, it really, as you said, it's paradigmatic. It really kind of sets forward the kind of storytelling that she wants to do. So it's really evocative of the later books in some ways. In other ways, it's deeply unique. There's stuff she's doing in this book that she doesn't do in any others, I don't think.
That's absolutely true. Let's pause for the benefit of our listeners.
Yes, let's get into
it. What is this book?
So 8 Days of Luke, boiled down, is about a unhappy orphan boy. He has to stay with miserable relations on his holidays. They don't like him. He doesn't like them.
Stop us if you've heard this one. This is a concept that actually comes back a fair bit in British children's literature.
It is a classic. It's playing the hits. While he is trying to curse his relations for how unhappy they're making him, he accidentally instead frees a strange boy called Luke, who seems to have unusual powers, instantly tells David that he is his benefactor and he'll do anything for him, including setting random buildings on fire to make David more entertained during a random day. Gradually, David begins to realize that sorry, we're going to be spoiling books here as we talk about them. It probably
you can't do meaningful analysis of a book without spoiling it. If you were here for a non-spoilery review, go somewhere else.
Right.
It's been out for 40 years.
Exactly.
50 years. God, this book is 50 years old. We should say that. This came out in 1973.
Yes.
I think. which I was looking at it and I was like, this book is only 20 years after Return of the King came out. This book is a lot closer in time to J.R.R. Tolkien than it is to me.
It absolutely is. And the fact that, like, these books still feel so modern in a way. Like, they feel, even though they're very much of their time, but they also, like, they don't feel far away, to me. Maybe that's just because I grew up with them. In the way that Lord of the Rings, for example, feels far away, feels of a different era. I don't know if that's true for you.
Yeah, there is a timelessness about Diana Wynne Jones. At one point, reading through 8 Days of Luke, I was actually going, can I tell that it's the 1970s? And there were a couple of things. The rail strikes.
Yes.
But we do still have a lot of rail strikes. Like, that hasn't stopped.
The fact that he has to steal the radio to listen to cricket matches.
Yes.
That is very 70s. That's the one piece of sort of specific 70s technology, is that he has to steal the radio and go out in the backyard and listen to cricket matches instead of just being able to get it on his iPhone. Yeah. Not that his relations might buy him.
His relations would never get him an iPhone.
Exactly. Anyway, sorry, I got to complete the story of 8 Days of Luke. Luke, it turns out, is in fact the god Loki, who has escaped from prison. Again, we don't find that laid out specifically until the very end. What David knows is that there are mysterious and powerful people chasing Luke. They want David to turn Luke over to them, essentially. David gets into a couple of unwise bargains with them while trying to protect Luke, and finds at the very end that he has to go on a sort of mythical quest to find a lost, significant mythical object in order to get the other mysterious figures, who are, of course, the Norse gods of legends, off Luke's tail, which he...
Yeah, so we can spoil it, I think. That Luke is the god Loki, that the figures that David ends up in a series of conflicts and bargains with are Tyr and Woden and Thor, and the object he has to go on a quest for at the end is Thor's hammer, and he finds himself, if you like, in an epilogue, a final act of the story of Siegfried and Brunhilde. So he's suddenly sort of deeply mixed up in this very mythological world, but it's always right next door to the real world. So you step through a door in the house where your cousin is going to rent some rooms, and suddenly you're at the foot of the world tree.
Right.
And facing the Norns.
Which you can't do
so that's sort of,
without the help of some very ordinary children who happen to have followed you through that door.
Absolutely. And there's a goat there.
Yes.
And lots of things are, like, it's done with such a light touch, but there's this constant sort of shift from the very mythical and extraordinary world of Luke and the Norse gods back through to the very ordinary, like the very humdrum, normal, very real nastiness of David's relations. And this is a thing I found really striking in the book. Jones's use of character. Often when you have, like, a horrid, abusive family in a children's book, they are larger-than-life comedy figures. They're like Roald Dahl evil family. David's awful relations felt so real.
Right. They're never quite over the top. Like, the way in which they're mean to him is petty. It's petty meanness. They don't want to buy him new clothes because it's so expensive to keep buying a child new clothes. They don't want to, they blame him for having to give up their vacation because he happens to be home from school at an inconvenient time. And the thing that's hit over and over again is that despite the constant petty meanness, they expect him to be grateful for it, which is agony.
It is so effective, though. I think one of the things Diana Wynne Jones is really consistent about is the way she enters into a child's point of view and the injustice of being a child.
Yes.
Of how much of your life as a child you spend just powerless.
Yes.
And having to put up with all sorts of nonsense. And in a way, like the shift from, like, David is putting up with the nonsense of his own awful family to now he's putting up with the nonsense of Luke's awful family, the Norse gods. But it's explicitly laid out. These are the same. They're different, but they're the same. They're the same kind of pettiness and the same, like, long-standing grudges coming to the surface. And Jones is really, like, really respects that David's suffering is a suffering of injustice and unfairness, and the child's point of view on those things.
And something else I think it's important to mention when we're kind of laying out the overall plot summary of this book is that there's a sub-thread that's running through alongside this sort of epic struggle, which is David discovering that he's not alone in feeling this injustice in his family. He finds one ally among his terrible relations, which is Astrid, his awful cousin's wife, who at first seems just as bad as the rest. And then you sort of discover over the course of this book as they form an alliance that she, when David's not around, she's the scapegoat. She is sort of suffering under the same level of pettiness and meanness and injustice and has sort of become as small in her way to try and defend herself and fight back. And there's this really and at the end of the book, the happy ending is all the awful relations are packed off because it's discovered that they've been doing embezzlement crimes, and he gets to go live with Astrid.
With David
Bunny. Which is, again, very sort of classic British children's literature, very Dickensian. It all comes right, and the money that he's been deprived of is his now, and he gets to go and live with the good relation. But there's this really interesting parallel between the powerlessness of being a child and the powerlessness of being a young woman who's married into an awful family in the 70s, that I think is really interesting to see.
The conversation they have about it, where David says, if I could, I'd just go. And Astrid said, I would, but I'm a coward. I haven't any money.
Yes.
So the point is that the control of the money is what's controlling really both Astrid and David.
Yes.
It's really interesting. What was I going to say? I was going to talk about... Oh yes, this idea of Astrid becomes as bad as the rest of them. You can also see David becoming as bad as the rest of them. There's a bit where he's talking to Astrid and, she says, I get so angry I have to get at someone.
Yes.
And David says, I get at Mrs. Thirsk,
right,
who is the family's servant, who is also a very nasty piece of work. But also, this is David bullying the servants.
Right.
And then there's the idea that one of the ways you react to being treated really badly is to behave really badly because you stop caring.
Yes.
Because you know that so much of life is unjust. Why should you be any better?
Oh, there's this great quote. So there's this scene where David's bored, they're out shopping, they're waiting for Astrid to be done trying on dresses, and Luke is like, well, Luke says, what can I do to make you, to entertain you? And David's joking, not thinking that Luke can do anything. He says, set that building on fire. And Luke says, all right. And so then a horrible fire begins. And, he's feeling bad about the fire and about the damage that it's causing. But then it says the trouble was that David, particularly in the holidays, was so used to feeling guilty that he'd come to ignore it whenever he could. He found himself pretending that the fire was nothing to do with him, that it was probably nothing to do with Luke either, and that anyway he had no influence over Luke. And he's watching this building go up in flames and thinking, well, why should I care about this? It's not my fault because everything's my fault.
Absolutely. And it's almost as if, that sort of constant punishment he's received in the form of, why aren't you grateful? Why won't you be grateful? Why won't you say sorry? Why won't you say thank you? Has just sort of kind of turned off his moral sense, if you like, because it's so warped the way he's treated that it's warping him in turn. You can see it happening. And actually going back to the original release of Luke, of the Loki, it's because David thinks to himself, I wish I could get the law on my family, but I can't because they've not actually done anything wrong.
Yes.
This turns out to be false. They have done things that they could be punished legally for. But it isn't actually a crime to be a dick to a kid. It is a crime to be actively abusive to a kid, but it's quite hard to prove when the abuse is
emotional. Neglect.
David is mostly just sent away to boarding school. It's emotional abuse, right? And it's the 1970s. But David's anger at something he sees as they haven't actually done anything wrong. I can't get them for anything, but I want to get them anyway. And his decision to curse his family and to come up with some sort of evil curse on them, he sees it as an amoral decision, as something he's doing that they deserve, but they don't deserve. There's a quote later on in the book where Joan says, there's a difference between bad things you do because you just do them and bad things you do because you have to. And then when he releases Loki, Danny Wynne Jones says in her essays, he's symbolically, he's amoral violence. Right. That is what David has unleashed.
And it's so
power of doing the wrong thing.
Instantly, it improves David's life so much. He likes Luke so much, and he likes this feeling of freedom that running around with Luke gives him so much. Yes.
Freedom and laughter.
Yes.
Right? Suddenly things are funny. He's having this completely miserable time, but once Luke turns up and he's laughing about everything, including Luke's immediately making jokes about, oh, my prison was much worse than this. Right. It's nothing like as heavy as a bowl of venom. And obviously he's being completely literal. He's been through hell. But the jokes and the camaraderie, the friendship makes it stop hurting.
He actually, when he releases Luke, they're attacked by snakes. Like, snakes rise out of the ground and attempt to attack both of them, and the whole garden falls down. And everything's on fire.
Everything's on fire.
They have to rebuild it all. And David is so happy about it. I put down this quote. It said, rebuilding the wall had wiped away all his misery and also the horror of the way the curse had worked. He thought of the flames and the snakes, but all they did was to remind him of Luke's joke about kindling a flame. And so now it's funny, and it's about this relationship that he has with Luke, and it improves, like, the horrors are not horrors, because he's got this bond with Luke.
Right. It's such a joyful moment. Should we talk about the queer
reading?
Yeah,
let's talk about it.
I feel like it's kind of hard not to talk about the queer reading.
We have to. I do have, I literally typed out every time that David is describing Luke, because it's very striking. He's looking at him all the time and just, happy to be looking at him.
There are some really lovely descriptions of Luke, but right, where is it? He had a sharp and freckly face under the dirty skin, under the dirt, and a burn or something on one cheek. His hair seemed to be red. At any rate, he had those kind of red-brown eyes that only go with red hair. David rather took to him. And David is constantly going back to Luke's beautiful eyes.
Yes. He's also, so Luke comes and hangs out in David's room at night and makes magic shows for him, essentially. He does these beautiful sort of shadow plays, and then falls asleep in David's room, and David, spends some time looking at his sleeping face and wondering who and what Luke really was. He was very freckly, which doesn't really answer who or what he is, but it's something that David thinks is worth noticing. And it's also impossible to tell how old or young he is, which is something that really strikes David, because Luke is and isn't a peer, isn't someone who's his same age, and is also, of course, someone who's infinitely old, because he's the god Loki.
Yeah, it's interesting when Luke first appears and David can't quite see him. He thinks, it must be Cousin Ronald. So he thinks an adult man. Then he thinks it must be Aunt Dot, so he thinks an old woman. And it's then only when Luke actually gets a good look at David that suddenly we have 13 or 14-year-old boy.
Yep.
And you get the very clear sense throughout that Loki is shaping himself to David's perceptions to what David needs him to be.
Right. He wants to be, he's grateful to David, but he also, he identifies really quickly, once people start chasing Luke, then, all right, so he's talking about Chew, who is one of the people chasing Luke. And Luke says, David says, I don't think he's stupid. And Luke says, yes, he is. Anyone else would have seen it was no good trying to frighten you. And David says, I was frightened. And Luke says, what if you were? It wouldn't make you say anything important. The way to get you talking is to be friendly. And I just hope none of them realize that. Because David is so starved for affection. And Luke immediately sees that and gives him that affection in spades. And David can see him doing this to other people. He does it to Astrid, too. He can, he pours on the charm. And people want to do what Luke wants.
Right, he is capable of instantly giving anyone what they want to see. And David's not an exception, especially to begin with. David is just getting what he needs, and he's very, very happy. But I think as a reader, you do have some doubts about Luke.
Yes.
Especially once you hit... I always come back to the moment when Luke sets the building on fire. And it's not like a little fire. This is a gigantic... fire in an office block in a crowded street. There are fire engines there. There are people running and screaming. There are two young women trapped on the roof who Luke just says,
Luke was staring intently at the building with a gentle, coaxing smile on his mouth. His red-brown eyes were smiling in a different, vivid way and moving up slowly over the building as he relishes the chaos and the destruction. And
and it's honestly, the description keeps going. It's honestly quite sexy.
Oh yes,
you can tell that Luke is very, very into this fire and this horrible destruction. And David does slowly have the moral awakening where he realizes he is responsible here. He does have to get Luke to stop because no one else is going to.
Yes. And I think to pull in a little bit of the queer reading and the gender note here, because I think that gender is something that you absolutely have to talk about in this book. The first thing, I think both of us immediately highlighted the line when David comes home and his relatives start going on at him about his long hair, which makes him look unmanly. But they're on they're watching the girls on the roof, trapped on the roof. And Luke is like, oh, they're just silly girls. They were in the mirror making their face up, and that's why they didn't manage to get out in time. They don't matter. And David's like, yes, they're just stupid girls. I still don't want them to die. And then he manages to snap Luke out of it by saying, Luke, you can't bring the dead back to life. And that does, it makes a change. Somehow that seemed to be the right thing to say. Which I think both emphasizes the connection that David and Luke have. David understands Luke out of this sort of kinship that they have and the way to make him pull back from the brink. But it's also in the way that David, who is, older than 10, we know, probably 13 or 14.
I think, Diana Wynne Jones does say in her essay she resists giving specific ages to the children, but I think David does feel quite specifically to me like he's in his final year of prep school, which would be like coming up to a senior boarding school, so he'll be 13. So just like, he's just at the point where he's starting to get really tall really fast, which is why his relatives are complaining about his long hair and his clothes not fitting and his unmanly appearance. That really did strike me, that it jumps out immediately. The question of masculinity is raised. Something's not right about David, according to his nasty relations.
And as a 13-year-old, the way he thinks about girls consistently through this book, with the exception of, as he sort of starts to form this bond with Astrid, is they're sort of silly and sort of irrelevant. He's got no interest in them. He doesn't want them to die. Sometimes it's, he'll have a nice conversation with an adult woman. But girls his own age and younger, nothing.
Yeah. There's a moment that's really striking to me is on the Friday of the week, the titular 8 days, right? The book is very, very tightly structured by the days of the week, which are, of course, the Norse gods. So Mr. Chew turns up on Tuesday, and there's a joke about it. David goes, "Oh, it's funny that Mr. Chew turned up on Tuesday," and it's like, funnier still if he turned up on Monday.
And David doesn't get
Wedding,
it then.
He doesn't get it at that point. Mr. Wedding, who is Woden, turns up on Wednesday. The ginger man, who's never named, but who is Thor, shows up on Thursday. And on Friday, two figures appear, the Frys, who are, of course, Frey and Freya, the fertility gods. And Mrs. Fry comes up to David and is extremely friendly to him. And David's reaction is really equivocal.
Yes.
He meets the ultimate sort of incarnation of female beauty and sexuality, and he's like, I don't know.
Feels like she's coming on a bit strong.
Yeah, no, I've got the quote somewhere.
Yeah.
Mrs. Fry came on to David. David backed away. She gave him a most peculiar feeling. It was not unpleasant, but it felt too strong for him. "Hello, youngster," she said gladly. "I like you." And this is the point at which David starts to turn against her. By the end of that scene, he is really not happy with the Frys, and Mrs. Fry actually comes out as the villain of the sequence, where she is the person who is most aggressively anti-Luke and most unfair to Luke.
So when he meets Woden, when he meets Thor, both of them, like, when he meets Woden, he has almost the same reaction as to when he meets Luke. He sees Mr. Wedding's face. He was taken aback to find that it was the face he could not help liking. It was an agreeable, firm face, not young and not old, like Luke's face, and rather lined. And the most perplexing thing was the way David found himself wanting to go with Mr. Wedding and very pleased to be asked. He struggled for a moment and then found he had to give in. So he meets these gods. He has, they all have this way of getting around a person and this way of sort of making themselves liked. And he has this reaction to Loki. He has this reaction to Mr. Wedding. He has this reaction to Thor. And Mr. Wedding and Thor are the ones who are sort of most sympathetic to Luke in a way, and obviously David's sympathies are already engaged. But the Frys, absolutely not. Like, they have no way inroads to him. They're sort of, the way that they come on just makes him uncomfortable.
Right. And similarly, he sort of more or less ignores the Valkyrie, who is chauffeuring Mr. Woden around the large white car. He does have a very strong reaction when he finally encounters the sleeping Brunhilde. But it's about Luke. It's textually about Luke. So I've lost track of what I was saying.
All right, so here's my question. Do we want to talk about the ending yet, or do we want to save it?
Let's save the ending.
But while we're talking about queer readings, I'm going to jump in and say, so one of the things that Diana Wynne Jones always does, and she talks about all through Reflections, is how she's weaving different stories into her books. And unfortunately, this means that now I've discovered that having reread Reflections and then jumping into a read of Diana Wynne Jones right after that means that I'm always looking for those echoes now. So rereading 8 Days of Luke right after that, I'm like, why is he named David? Well, is it because of, looking at this romantic friendship, I think it's safe to say that it's a romantic friendship between David and
It's
Lydia.
a romantic friendship, yeah. I think that's true, regardless of how else you read it. Like this, it's an intense emotional connection, which excludes everyone else of all genders, to be clear. Like,
Yes.
David makes another friend at one point, Alan, and is quite annoyed with Luke for apparently not knowing that Alan exists.
Right.
But Luke is only interested in David.
So at first I thought, King David, and then, especially when I hit the name Alan. So David Balfour and Alan Breck Stewart are the protagonists of Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped, which is another very classic work of romantic friendship about a young orphan boy with horrible relations who saves a dangerous redheaded older man named Alan who's on the run from the law, and then spends the entire book trekking through the Scottish countryside with him, going, well, I don't know that I agree with this strong stance that you have. This, in this case, it's obviously about the Jacobite Rebellion. I'm on the opposite side of this. Morally, I disagree with much of what you're doing, but we have this strong kinship and bond, and I'm bound to help you and assist you no matter what. And I was like, okay,
yeah, no, that's there, isn't it? That's intense romantic friendship, and some of what David is searching for, I think, in the book is sort of masculine role models, masculine places to belong. It's noticeable in the opening chapter that the relation we think is going to be the most sympathetic is cousin Ronald.
Yep.
Because David wants so much for Ronald to give him something. So he's daydreaming about telling Ronald about his cricket successes at school, because David is classic Diana Wynne Jones cricket boy.
Cricket boy. I have
we will come back to this archetype.
All caps in my notes. And you have to imagine Diana Wynne Jones she had 3 sons, I believe?
She had 3 sons.
Having had cricket explained to her on innumerable occasions by her 3 sons, going, what do boys like to talk about?
I think she must have been a fan herself, because I come from a family of cricket boys. I have had cricket explained to me. It does not stick. And this might be a personal failing. Like, there comes a point after 30 years where you think, maybe I should be able to remember what happens in cricket, My mother is passionate about this shit. Nope.
Well, Diana, she understands your point of view. We'll get to that later with some other archetypal cricket boys.
They do come back. But yeah, it's many of David's happiest moments in the book are about playing cricket. Which is interesting, because those are moments of team and belonging in a group, and he does not have that with Luke. Luke sort of condescends to play cricket.
Right, he makes the god Loki play cricket to him, and Loki is like, fine. I don't understand why there are 7 other people here, but sure.
But yes, what I was saying, David is looking for masculine connections. He wants Ronald to like him, to respect him. That moment when he realizes he's as tall as cousin Ronald, he's
or even a little bit taller.
Yeah. And it becomes increasingly clear, actually, that Ronald is probably the worst of the lot in terms of the awful relations. And you feel more and more sorry for Astrid as his wife the more you learn about him. But then later, David's instant sort of attraction to Mr. Wedding, his instant attraction to Thor, I'm not talking necessarily in terms of a romantic attraction, but in terms of wanting their attention, their approval, of wanting to belong here.
Yes.
And then finally, when they visit the fairground at Wolsey, which is simultaneously a pretty rough country fairground and the Heroes' Hall of Valhalla.
Mm-hmm.
And Diana Wynne Jones is always doing things with names. Wolsey, Valhalla.
Yes.
Which is on an island in the middle of the lake, reached across an iron bridge, which, when the light strikes it, gives rainbow reflections. And you're like, I see what you did there.
Gorgeous.
One of them, Kate just has these most exquisite descriptions when she goes into the mythic mode. But then, again, when he reaches Wolsey and it's this all-male environment, Astrid is explicitly told not to come because they won't let her in.
Yep.
And Luke goes, yeah, they blackballed me years ago and it's an all-boys club. So the people who end up going to Valhalla are David, his new friend Alan, and the awful cousin Ronald.
Alan, who is just there to be a sort of a boy ally. They need 3 people. And so he picks up this friend who David is like, I don't think he's very bright, but he's a very good sidekick.
That's great for Alan.
Yep.
I feel a bit sorry for him.
Right.
Right, but David's reaction to Valhalla is like this hall of like noisy young men having fun. Okay, yeah, the heroes of Valhalla, and they're imagined as like 70s working class lads having fun at the fairground. So a lot of the young men had jackets with emblems or pictures on the backs: death's heads, arrows, tigers, streaks of lightning. David saw badges, flowing ties, bands round hair, and patterns on shirts. They were a very dressy lot, and very happy too. David was discouraged. There were no girls or women in the groups, just noisy young men enjoying life and cheating the pinball machines. And this is the warrior heaven as imagined for 1970s England.
Mm-hmm. And it fits perfectly. Like it flows seamlessly.
It's exquisite. Is that move from mythic to everyday and back again is so Diana Wynne Jones. It's one of the reasons that this book feels paradigmatic. But I've got off my point. What I wanted to say was David wants to belong in this all-male club. He wants to be like Siegfried is, Woden's favourite. He wants to have this connection with Woden. He wants to be with Thor. He wants to be with Luke. He wants men.
Yes.
He wants male company. He wants male belonging.
And he's so ashamed of, when we come back to this idea of masculinity, he's so ashamed of Cousin Ronald all through this sequence. Even when it's just him and Alan, and Cousin Ronald is being cheap. He won't buy them things. He's, being kind of stingy. And David is like, I'm so...
Again, David's money.
With David's money.
It's going to be clear later, it's David's money.
And he's so embarrassed to have this as his sort of older male relation that he's attached to be seen as sort of part of this unit with Uncle Ronald. And then when they're in Wolsey, the way to find the information that they need is to go through this sort of classic frat bro hazing, where they have to run. It is simultaneously a frat bro hazing and a classic test of strength and valor in the heroic tradition.
Diana Wynne Jones says those are the same thing. These are not different things.
Exactly. And they have to run the gauntlet of all of Siegfried's boys, punching them as they sort of run down a long tube. Tube.
There's like a double line of young men doing the slow hand clap.
Yep.
While the three of them take it in turns to run down getting punched.
Yep.
And it's very clearly like Siegfried says, and I love that she put this line in Siegfried's mouth. It's a bit of a giggle, really. It's lighthearted. They are not actually getting beaten up. Like they come out of it like fairly bruised, drubbed around the ribs, black eye, but like they're fine.
Right,
and
but it is
we'll come back to this idea of lighthearted violence as essential for male connection comes back a bit, especially in these early Jones books.
Oh yes. But it is like it's a genuine test of valor for these, kind of skinny, scrawny teenage boys running through this, these large, heroic, muscly
literally
these
the warrior heroes of legend.
Yes. Sort of pounding at them as they go. And then it's Cousin Ronald's turn, and Cousin Ronald breaks down. He wails, he squalls.
He's pathetic.
He's deeply pathetic, and he's the adult. And he's the one who, when David comes home initially, is like, well, Cousin Ronald, who's my, not my horrible older relation, but my cool adult relation, is the one I can connect with. And David just stands there feeling so ashamed of Ronald for failing this test of physical courage that is sort of the ultimate barrier to entry into the Hall of Heroes.
And it's another moment, actually, where Luke is the one who redeems it later, when Luke sort of turns around and says, but anyone would think you two were twins. You're taking it so seriously.
Right.
Not those exact words. I haven't got the quote, but it's again a moment of like Luke laughing at David's moments of shame and misery, and he's able to turn it into something to joke about, but also something that David has some distance from. And the mythic world repeatedly is what gives David the distance, the strength to look at his experiences with his awful relations and not let it hurt him anymore. Actually, I want to come back to the midpoint of the book, which I think, as I said, the book is so tightly structured and it's all sort of fanning out from this middle moment. Wednesday,
yes.
Mr. Woden,
yes.
Mr. Wedding, turns up and David visits Valhalla for the first time, not as Wolsey. The first time he goes, it's not the fun fair, it is the genuine mythic world that he's entered. And they get lunch. They get a really good pub lunch.
And David is so happy, loves this lunch. I
mean, one thing that feels really true about David, actually, is he really, really likes food.
Yes.
Because he's 13 and he's growing.
He's 13, he loves food, he loves cricket, and he loves blunt honesty. He loves the truth.
Yes. The thing about this central point is Woden gives David a piece of advice. Right? He gives him lunch and he gives him advice. And the advice he gives is, as David said, the thing about my relations, the reason I don't like them, I know that they're taking care of me, and it would be a lot easier if I didn't have to be grateful all the time. And that core like problem of the gratitude that he's expected to feel while they treat him badly. And Woden goes, well, you don't. You don't have to feel grateful to these people, because it is the law that they have to take care of you. They are doing the absolute bare minimum they're legally required to do. And let me get the quote because it's exquisite. Look at it this way. You're still a child and you can't earn your living or look after yourself properly. When you were younger, you could do it even less. All children are the same. So the law says that someone has to look after you until you can do it for yourself. Your guardians in your case. And there's another law which says that when you drop a stone, it falls to the ground. Are you grateful to that stone for falling? Or does the stone ask the earth to be grateful? And this kind of breaks open the central problem of David's life in his mind. He goes, I don't have to be grateful. I don't. And it's a moment of amazing freedom for him, in the same way that Luke has been giving him these moments of freedom. Yes. From how miserable he feels with his awful family.
And then...
Yes!
And then he immediately tries to turn it around. Odin, trickster god, all father, asks David if he's going to turn Luke over. He puts it very reasonably. He says, Luke stole something tremendously important from us, and we need to have it back. We just want to ask him where it is. And David thinks about this. He thinks it's a reasonable request. He really tries to think about it fairly.
It's really well done how Woden sort of leads up to it. He points out that Luke is a bad person, which David already knows. Right. To the sort of the whole office fire incident, that Luke is capable of terrible things. David knows that. He knows what Luke is like.
He knew Luke well enough now to see the way he would have done the terrible thing. With a strange, absent-minded smile, because whatever it was had been a clever idea and rather difficult to do. So he thinks about it, and then he thinks about the prison that Luke has talked about, and he thinks about his own unhappiness with his relations. He's like, well, I think it would have been fair for Luke to take the revenge. I think I would have taken the revenge in his shoes. And I think this is actually a little bit before, but what Mr. Wedding says, can you help me at all? And David says, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Wedding, I can't. Perhaps you mean you won't, suggested Mr. Wedding. Yes, but I still can't, David said. He can't do it. It's just not, it's not an option. It's not even a choice.
Absolutely. And then Mr. Wedding is quite angry with him and says the laws of hospitality mean nothing to you. And you can see he is explicitly a Norse god. He has given you food. He has made you a guest in his hall. And how are you repaying him? I've given you some advice which you might have gone through all your life without learning anywhere else, and I've given you a good meal. In return, you treat me as an enemy. You don't appear to understand that the least you can do is help me find Luke. Oh no, I needn't, said David. How do you make that out? Mr. Wedding asked scornfully. I haven't lived with Uncle Bernard all these years without knowing when someone isn't playing fair, said David. I've had a marvellous time and a brilliant lunch, and thank you. The advice was even better. But you can't tell me that the earth's not grateful to a stone for being dropped on and then say I owe you for lunch. You did it all for a reason, and that's not fair.
It's so good. And it's so, okay, so it's doing multiple things. One is it's dropping into the realm of Norse myth. Explicitly, it's the guest right. It's the All-Father setting you a challenge. And how David knows to counter it is both sort of just his innate directness, his sense of justice from being a child, and what he's learned from his horrible relations, from watching Uncle Bernard, who is a past master at manipulation. One of the things that's set up through this book is Uncle Bernard and Astrid have these contests about who's more self-sacrificing and who's feeling worse. They have these illness contests, and David keeps score.
So funny. It's very funny. I don't think we've said this enough. This book is also very funny.
It's brilliant. And eventually he tells Astrid about it. He starts giving her tips. He's like, you have to start saying what you've got is contagious and that you're afraid of giving everyone else the illness. That'll get you more points than Uncle Bernard. But by seeing the pettiness of his human relations and the way in which they sort of are able to use words to wriggle around each other and get what they want, he's able to use that to stand against the king of the Norse gods, and say, what you're doing is you're trying to manipulate me, and that is unfair, and it goes against my code of honor. Again, this Norse idea and this heroic idea, and I won't do it.
So this is sort of putting this book in the context of 1970s children's books specifically. There's a rule that children's books were only allowed to deal with problems. And of course, this is the days of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Mm-hmm. Which, to be fair, is a great example of the genre. If you want a children's book about problems, there you go. So you took a social problem and you wrote about this problem in stark, distressing terms. Then, this is the rule, you gave it to the child with that problem to read. The child was supposed to delight in the insight. This rule is still enforced today. People truly believe in it. And this despite the obvious question that Jill Patton Walsh once asked, if you were divorcing, what would you think of the person who made you read Anna Karenina? But right, this is 8 Days of Luke is, in its way, a problem book. David is a child with a problem. His problem is an awful family. And the book is doing the thing that the problem book is supposed to do, which is to help its reader understand how to deal with that problem. But Diana Wynne Jones does it by taking David out of that miserable daily grind of emotional abuse and into this mythic realm where he can then stand in the mythic realm, apply the lessons he's learned and say, look, I know you're not playing fair. But she talks elsewhere in the essays about how that's what the mythic realm is almost for. The realm of the imagination is for giving you the space to think through problems in a way that gives you that distance, that ability to laugh, that ability to be sort of heroic, if you like, triumphant, proud.
Yes. And that's what Luke represents.
Yes.
It's the ability to laugh at it. It's the ability to be heroic about it. David can be heroic in service of Luke. He's got this oath friend, if you want to put it that way, and he has to.
Oh gosh, yes.
It's not that he won't, but that he can't. He cannot betray that friendship.
Absolutely. And there's the whole bit with gratitude afterwards where actually David is thinking about this whole idea of gratitude. And he goes to Luke and he says, you don't need to be grateful to me for letting you out. I did it by accident. So he's honorable. Obviously, Luke is like the best thing that's ever happened to him at this point, but he tries to break that bond of like, you owe me, because it doesn't feel fair to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes back and says, you happen to then accidentally stand up for me to chew, and then quite by mistake to wedding, come off it, David. And by that point, it's clear that the relationship is not just Luke shaping himself to David's needs. At that point, there is a real connection between the two of them.
Yes, because David has made the choice over and over again to defend Luke.
Coming back to the romantic reading, this idea of like, I know he's awful, I know what he is, I know he's a monster, and I'm choosing him anyway.
Yes.
And I won't betray him, and I won't back down. That is a romantic dynamic, and it is one that Diana Wynne Jones comes back to. I know we said we weren't jumping forward. I'm breaking the rule already. It's Polly and Tom in Fire and Hemlock. I know what he really is. I'm not backing down.
Yep.
It's Howl and Sophie. I know he's a liar and a monster and he's heartless. I'm not backing down. It's Vieran and Mordian in Hexwood. I know he's a terrible intergalactic space assassin. We'll come back to that when we get there.
It's Tamlin. If we're going to go to the underlying stories, Tamlin is explicitly in Fire and Hemlock. We will get there. But Luke, and one of the things that in the Ballad of Tamlin, you hold on to the flame. She turns him into a flame, and Janet has to hold on to him in order to get to keep him. And we get to the end of this book, and it's David has to go through the fire, the all-consuming fire that Luke is, and that Luke set to consume all things in order to get the thing.
It's also, of course, the challenge that Siegfried had to do in the story of Siegfried and Brunhilde to win love. Right. Is to go through the fire. And so then David explicitly becomes the Siegfried. Right.
All right. We have to talk about the ending, but before we have to talk about the ending, okay, I want to back away from the romantic friendship for a second. I think we're going to come back there via a roundabout way. I want to talk about Astrid for a second.
Yes.
Because again, as we said a little bit already, but I think one of the things that she talks about, I don't have the exact quote in Reflections, but is about these rules of children's books. That you have an adventure, the children are doing the adventure, the adults are not there. They're gone. They're not involved. And immediately, halfway through this book, she breaks that rule by pulling Astrid in, and not just by having David form this bond with Astrid, but Astrid is in on all of it. She meets Thor. She is the one who figures out first, before David, what's going on, which is something that
she knows who Thor is really, really quickly. Possibly because they're almost immediately banging on the riverbank. Like,
yes.
it's not explicit, but I think that's pretty clear. Like, there's a whole sequence on the Thursday where Thor catches up with Luke, and they have this like half antagonistic, half friendly relationship where it's really clear that they're very old friends and they understand each other very well. And you almost sort of hovering in the background is sort of the stories of Thor and Loki, which are never on the page at all. Never, nope. ever. There's no sense that, by the way, we have a fun cross-dressing episode in our mutual past.
Absolutely not.
but at the same time, you can tell that Jones knows. And then Thor says, all right, fair enough. Like, I caught you for the day. I am giving you a day off being horrified. Let's just have fun. Yes. So they go down to the riverbank, and David and Luke play in the river. But I mean, it is playtime. They're having a blissful, relaxing time, and meanwhile, they can hear Thor and Astrid laughing and talking on the bank.
Yep.
And that is about all the hint you get that Thor and Astrid are having an affair. But Thor and Astrid are definitely having an affair.
And this is not us speculating. Diana does confirm that in Reflections, when she talks about her editor catching on to the fact that Thor and Astrid are having an affair, and saying, so does that mean that Luke is gay?
No, does that mean David is gay?
Sorry, does that mean that David is gay? Yes.
Right, because Astrid and David are parallel.
Yes.
So while Thor and Astrid are having an affair, is David having his own romantic encounter with the divine? Obviously he is.
Obviously. But the connection between Astrid and David, I think, is so interesting because they are so paralleled. It gives her the chance to tell this story about an adult who has been trapped in this situation via an ill-advised romantic relationship, and now can't get out in the same way the child is trapped, to say something about what it means to be a woman in a bad marriage in the 1970s. And also, Astrid as a character, she's not just a symbol or a representative. She's fun, she's distinct, she's unique, she's very mean sometimes. She loves spending money. She loves spending money on Luke and David, and that's sort of the first way that they get at her, is they get her away from the rest of the family, and they go out on a shopping trip. And suddenly she's having fun, which she hasn't had for years. And that gets her on
David actually thinks
side.
he can only remember her being this jolly very back at the beginning when he first came to live with his relations. And they are very much in this like same emotionally abusive life.
Right. And when they go to the house where Astrid's going to pretend, quote unquote, to look for rooms to rent, while David goes in through the basement to find the World Tree. And then they leave, and Astrid says, well, I wasn't really pretending. I was thinking that it might be, maybe we could both get out. If we did it together, we could both get out, and you could come to live with me. So she says, those rooms I saw, they're really nice. I took a chance and told her we'd take them, keeping my fingers crossed and hoping you'd agree, because I can't see myself managing alone, and I don't want to leave you to your fate with Bernard and Dot. So it's not that she's rescuing David. It's that they have this possibility of mutual rescue. Astrid doesn't feel like she can live alone. She's a 25-year-old woman. I think her age is made explicit at some point.
No, she is. She's been telling everyone she's 25 for 6
years.
You're
right.
She's 31.
She's 31. She's a 31-year-old woman. And she can't imagine herself living alone. She feels like she needs David, who is a 13-year-old boy, to make it a viable proposition, which is almost, so fascinating.
I think, to give her a reason to get out, I think.
Yes.
Someone to do it for. And there's that bit at the end where she's thinking, I used to make pretty good money as a typist. So she's not actually helpless. She's not going to have no money when she's out. But this learned helplessness, this trapped situation. I think we have to talk about the ending to talk about this, because Astrid, I think, has the last word in the book.
Yes.
So to get there, shall we talk through David's encounter with Brunhilde?
Yes, but before we talk about David's encounter with Brunhilde, we have to go back to the tree. Because when he meets the Norns, they say to him, all right.
You'll see a face tomorrow.
You'll see a face tomorrow that you won't forget in a hurry. We'll go in peace, but don't think the rest of your life's going to be easy. And that's the quote that haunts the end of the book.
Right, this book in some ways is like a straightforward happy ending, in that our sad orphan is no longer sad and living with bad relations. And Luke gets away. We can say that he gets away from the punishment of the Norse gods. They do catch up with him, but he doesn't get sent back to prison. David saves him from that.
And
by
unlike
going on
in
the quest
many
for Thor's hammer.
Unlike in many children's books, that explicitly doesn't mean that the adventure is over, that he's going to stop seeing Luke. They're going to see each other on Monday, the next week. Luke is still
in fact,
in David's
evening
life.
At the end of the book, they're going to see each other tomorrow.
Yes.
Luke has been, at this point, awake for, I think, 48 hours, using his powers to prevent the eternal flames on Brunhilde's hillside from burning David alive. And you can see how frightened he is for David.
Yes.
I kept thinking you're only human, and how exhausted he is by the time David comes out.
Yeah. But I feel like in the majority of books like this, especially written at this time, the adventure ends, the magic is over. It's not over for David, and that is the blessing and the curse.
Absolutely. But the face you won't forget in a hurry. And that is the face of Brunhilde. So let's talk about Siegfried and Brunhilde. So one thing that comes up a lot in Reflections is a book that was clearly very important to Diana Wynne-Jones, which she said was her grandmother's copy of a book called Epics and Romances of the Middle Ages, which was a school prize for her when she was 9. So I went looking.
And I found it.
On Project Gutenberg, published 1886 in German and then translated into English the following year. The Epics and Romances of the Middle Ages. I haven't finished reading, but I did skip straight to the Nibelungen, which is an adaptation of the High Medieval Nibelungenlied for Siegfried and Brunhilde. And I have to say that, like, it doesn't read very much like 8 Days of Luke at all. Like, it's clearly down there in the bedrock, but this is working off... There are 2 traditions of the Siegfried story. There's the Germanic Siegfried, and there's the Scandinavian Sigurd. And 8 Days of Luke is much more Scandinavian tilted. The Germanic one is really funny because it's very explicitly set in the medieval period, and everyone keeps saying things like, "We can't escape the fate of the Norns," what our pagan ancestors would have said. Not us, we're Christians.
Oh my god! I didn't get
you
a
can
chance
really
to read
see
this.
the sort of the difficulty they're having adapting 2 very different worldviews to each other.
And that's something that she talks about too. That Diana talks about in one of the essays is the trouble with trying to set a mythic story in your own time, and how everyone does make it in their own time eventually.
Yes. Yeah, no, I pulled that out because I think that's quite relevant to 8 Days of Luke. Hang on. It's quite obvious that people in the Middle Ages conceived of this story time as being contemporary with their own. That made me very wistful at the time because I couldn't imagine my favourite knight, Sir Gawain, in a suit or tweeds, however hard I strained to see it. You know, she's right. I still can't quite see it.
But she sort of does it.
She does. We'll get there. She does absolutely do that. It's a very important idea. If you're going to write for a non-historical, forward-looking audience, i.e. children, you need the story time to be here and now. I took this idea up with enthusiasm. It's why most of what I write is set in the modern age whenever possible. And then she name drops 8 Days of Luke as an example.
Yep. Paradigmatic for what she wants to be doing.
Yes, exactly. So, going back to the treatment of Brunhilde in 8 Days of Luke. So in the final chapter of this book, and the whole mythic quest section of this like fantasy book is actually very tightly compressed into the last 2 or 3 chapters.
Yeah, it's only a 140-page book. And the mythic quest is
probably
maybe
a novella by you can read it quickly, and you should. Like, please, this is not a book recommendations podcast. This is a like we are talking about a book we love podcast, but you probably should read this one. It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's sort of funny, I'm going to confess that when I was a kid, this was one of my least favorites because I had not yet learned to read books about boys, and this is such a book about masculinity.
It really is. She actually mentions that as well. She talks about how her early books she wrote about boys because girls were willing to pick up books with boys in them, but not the other way around, at least not in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. Brunhilde! We keep getting off the topic.
Yes.
So in this version, David, of course, passes through the flames, which are the impossible challenge, the ultimate challenge of heroism, Siegfried's challenge, but also it is, as you said, the Tamlin challenge, embracing the flame. And they are Luke's own doing, and Luke has, every time Luke looks at a fire, he goes weird and sexy about it. There's no exception. So Luke is very proud of these flames. At the same time, he realizes they're horrifying and could destroy David utterly. And in the middle, he finds what he thinks is a grave. And when he first looks at it, he goes up to it, and there's this very beautiful description of the body lying in the midst of fire and all the colours changed by the fire about them. Then he looked onto the body's face and found it was a lady. Somehow that upset him. It was not simply that she was dead without reason and lying in the middle of timeless flames. It was that she had the most beautiful face he had ever seen. Even with her eyes shut and red in the flames, she was beautiful. In a way, she reminded David a little of the lady who had driven Mr. Wedding's car, except that this dead face was full of living feelings. It was a face that had no business to be dead. David gazed at it, and it dawned on him that he had never seen anyone look so sad. When the lady died, she must have been more unhappy than he had known anyone could be.
That's the face that he will not be forgetting.
And that is the moment when he realizes who Luke is. It's right there, like in the next paragraph. That's when he understands it. And then he sees that she's got Thor's hammer. Brunhilde has taken it as vengeance for the way that the whole story of Siegfried and Brunhilde turns out, as she has decided that ultimately Odin is to blame for their tragedy. And she has a point. And David retrieves the hammer. He says the flames blurred a little in front of David as he reached out to pick the hammer up. And that's all the hint you get that he's crying, the blurring of his vision. And then looking at the lady's unhappy face, he thought he knew a little what she felt like, just a little. But why she should lie here so sad was still a mystery to him.
This is right after the trouble was he knew who Luke was too, and he would never be able to think of Luke in the same way again.
Yeah. So there, I think at that point, we sort of see in this world of like parallels of the ordinary and the mythic and the in-between, which is the world that children live in, David sort of understanding one of the parallels he's living in, which is this sort of mortal and immortal relationship. And it hurts. It really hurts.
And then we get to Astrid, who has the last word on this. Because after the success, they come out, they give the hammer to Odin, they all get back in the car. David climbed over to the front seat while Astrid started the engine. "Well, David," she said, "that's that." David looked at her to remind her that Luke was still there. There was the same expression on Astrid's face that he had seen on the ladies in the flames. David was rather surprised that she should be sad. Getting rid of Cousin Ronald seemed to him a thing to rejoice at. He looked away at first because he thought that kind of sadness must be private. Then he thought of that other lady. He had wanted to do something for her because she was sad, and he knew he never would be able to, but he might manage to comfort Astrid. "What's the matter?" he said. "Oh, what a comfort you're here again," she said. "Nothing you can help about, David. Wouldn't you say it was worth it to be really happy for a while, even if you knew you were going to end up sad ever after?" David thought of the lady in the flames, asleep and sad forever, and did not know.
It's that moment of ambivalence. Is that he has no answer for the question of, is it worth it to have that little bit of happiness and the consequences that come after it?
And that
I want to pick up. Go on. No.
Oh no, go for it. I was just gonna say that the echo of just how happy they can be and how sad they're going to be. You can feel it in the book.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it is. And I think it is. Okay, I do think that actually Astrid is mourning her relationship with Ronald here. Like, you could argue that it's Thor. She is having an affair with Thor. But honestly, she's only known him since Thursday, and it's Sunday night.
They've met twice. They had a lovely day on the riverbank, and then they had ice cream together while everyone else was going through having a trial of masculinity.
Right. Which sounds like great fun, and like the sort of thing that happens when you realise that your old relationship is shit and you meet a handsome fellow.
Who is the Norse god of thunder.
Yeah, no, this happens to me all the time. But I think Astrid is mourning the death of her marriage with Ronald. Was it worth it to be really happy for a while, even if you knew you were going to end up sad ever after? I think it is clear from the beginning of the book that Ronald can be superficially appealing.
Because she charms David. David has been going to these relatives for years, and it's only now that he's starting to be a threat to Ronald, that he's a little bit taller than Ronald, and a little bit more clearly, younger, taller, and smarter than Ronald, that Ronald's claws really start to come out for David.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, this is speculation. Astrid is a young woman who was probably 25 when she got married, who was single, alone, working as a typist. She doesn't seem to have any other family either.
Mm-mm.
She doesn't have anyone to go to. She needs a 13-year-old boy to give her the courage to get out. And she marries money. And
Yep.
Astrid
David's
loves
money,
money.
actually.
Yeah, but she doesn't know that. And
She has no
Astrid, as we
idea.
know, is one of the characteristics. She loves spending money. And this is not presented as a negative thing. It's quite the opposite, actually. It's almost a heroic characteristic. She likes to buy more and more ice cream for the boys. She
Well,
likes
like,
more and more dresses. She likes to be big and expansive rather than this pinched and tiny and
mm-hmm.
unkind and stingy world that Ronald inhabits. And Ronald's stinginess is one of the things that's most shameful about him. That despite
Yes.
actually being filthy rich on David's money, he's not willing to spend enough to like buy him new clothes that fit.
Mm-hmm. They won't even
The
buy him an
only
ice
thing,
cream.
the only time that David's relatives ever admit that it might be worth it to spend money is to get David's hair cut. And David said it would be cheaper not to cut my hair. Hanging around your ears that unmanly way, it's a question of right and wrong. That's a quote.
That's their ethics system. And we're presented with this quite different world of ethics, of right and wrong, of what you can and can't do through Loki and through Mr. Wedding. That's just orthogonal to what David's
Right,
relatives.
this world of honor and generosity and expansiveness.
And
But
generosity, you're absolutely right that it's, that's one of those sort of heroic virtues. And
yes,
to David's relatives, it's a vice. It's when Astrid is able to show that generosity, that sort of heroic virtue, that's when they're able to bond.
absolutely. So I think actually that moment of would you say it was worth it to be really happy for a while is Astrid talking about not what her marriage with Ronald was, but what she wanted it to be,
Mm-hmm.
which is the escape from drudgery, the escape from being a single unmarried woman with no family in the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
into something that, like the beautiful house in the country, the handsome husband, the dream. And of course, Ronald is superficial. You can see through it, and I think it's clear that Astrid saw through it very early and was sad ever after.
Sad
So
and bitter, and taking it out on David until they're finally able. And he was taking it out on her too. There's a point where she points out to David, "You only come and be nice to me when you want something from me." And David realizes that's true, that they've been, trying to use each other and manipulate each other the same way as everyone else in that family.
absolutely. So I think it's sort of that final moment of parallels where you have in the sort of the mundane, the petty, the small adult world, you have Ronald and Astrid, and that very ordinary human domestic drama of the end of a bad marriage. In the purely mythic world, you have Siegfried and Brunhilde and their great tragedy, divided forever, marked by misunderstanding and by vengeance. And then slipping in between those two worlds is David and Luke, echoing both.
Who are blissfully happy right now. The
At
moment of
the end of the book,
triumph. But like in the North story, where you have the prophecy that's foretelling you how it's going to end, you can see the tragedy sort of barreling down towards them.
absolutely. And David even looks at Luke and Mr. Wedding and thinks when the last battle comes, they're going to be on opposite sides. Because that is the prophecy. That's Ragnarok.
Yep.
Let's stop there.